Okay, so we're just going to jump straight into this. So the first section is over evolution. So how would you describe the general process of natural selection?
Natural selection works by whichever gene set is most likely to survive will also be the most likely to pass their genes down. I think Darwin said it's whoever's most adaptable, so they will be more likely to reproduce, and over time you get a more suited gene set for survival.
Right, there's variations, and the two-step process comes with the variations first, and then whether or not they stick with the population just depends on time. So if the variation sticks, the organism will survive and reproduce with this trait, and then it'll continue down the line, just like that. So how has evolution changed the way we see the world, specifically after Darwin's influence?
Well, since Darwin, we've thought about our origins more in terms of a common ancestor or a set of common ancestors, and then we're also more aware of things like how our behaviors, like medicines and hospitals, will affect the development of our species, and how our behaviors can affect the development of other species in a way that we never would have before.
Right, you touched on it a little bit, like with the idea of a tree of life, like all organisms are connected in some way. And it also changed the way that people think about the history of Earth. So after Darwin, people were like, the Earth might be formed 4.56 billion years ago. It's not just tied down to a biblical context for everyone anymore. And humans are also subject to natural laws, just like all other animals. So then why or why not is the process of evolution necessary for humans to know today?
Well, I would say it's necessary to know because any sort of advancement of the species, the question is automatically there of how you actually got there, and then how we relate to other species around us and how we are best able to survive. It has to be informed by the way that we got to where we are and how we progress going forward.
Right, great. And also the idea of bacteria and how they evolve from pesticides with farmers. So it's important for like the economic standpoint there also, just to know how organisms grow, reproduce with these new traits, depending on how we interact with them. So the next set of questions over neurobiology. So what is the structure of the human nervous system and how do signals move in between neurons? Basically, how do they work? Just how do neurons work?
Yeah. Okay. So neurons take signals from the previous neuron. There's a electrical signal that travels through it. The change in charges, depolarization, hyperpolarization, causes different chemicals to react according because of change in charges. That so you can have more neurotransmitter pass the next neuron. You do that over millions of neurons, and you can get physical reactions that lead to movement or sensations or emotions. And that's structured in the nervous system primarily through the brain, which is the control center, connected to the spinal cord, goes all the way down to the body, and then out from there, peripheral nervous system made up of this kind of disgusting skeleton of web neuron thing.
Right, you hit it well. The central nervous system is the brain, the spine. The peripheral is basically just everything else. And the peripheral can also be categorized with the somatic nervous system, which is voluntary responses like motor movements, and then the autonomic nervous system, which is involuntary movements like fight or flight or your heart calming down, essentially. So, and then building on that, so how are the nervous systems of non-human animals similar or different from humans?
I guess it depends on the animals, but I know like intelligence is based on the surface area of the brain that is innervated. So compared to the size of the body, so humans have a very large surface area, encephalized surface area, and relatively small bodies compared to that. So we're substantially more intelligent, even than something that has a bigger brain, because the surface area of the brain is not as large compared to the size of its body. And then there's differences in like structures. So what, like where the eyes are placed, for the size of different brain structures can emphasize different functions and so on.
Right, we just have a ton of neurons just built into this compact brain that just gives us a lot more opportunity to respond to different stimuli than other animals could, right? And then also in other animals like vertebrates and invertebrates are different in that vertebrates, their nerves go, all vertebrates have a brain and a spine. And we typically have a dorsal spine, while invertebrates, all their nerve cords are ventral or across like their stomach area. And they're usually less centralized and they're just different, essentially. And all organisms besides sea sponges do have true nervous systems regardless. So the next set of questions is over emotions and neurochemical basis. So where do you think hope and love originate in humans, and what may be evolutionary benefits for this?
So I would say that hope and love are kind of complex emotions or traits that come from the interpretation of um, neurotransmitters that we recognize as emotions. So if you have like a sexual drive or fear or something like this, you can look at those things and then make a judgment, like in the prefrontal cortex, appraise those reactions and come to the determination that you're experiencing love or hope or something more complicated like that.
Right. So the process of love is hardwired into humans for reproduction purposes. And you said that a little bit. And it's this process of different hormones like corticosteroids initially with the stress of love and attraction. And then it might move into some more dopamine and eventually down into oxytocin and less dopamine as you become attached to a partner. Right. So, and then on the topic of love and hope, how do you feel about anthropomorphism in animals, specifically with the emotion or idea of hope within animals?
Like whether or not they have it, or whether or not they can hope.
Essentially, is hope in animals, I guess.
I guess it's hard to know because we can never know exactly how they think about things or whether or not they're really aware of themselves. I think we know that, like dogs, for example, are somewhat aware of themselves. We know that dolphins are somewhat aware of themselves. And so in that way, most animals probably have the same emotional capacity. And then whatever animals have a consciousness, are aware of their own existence, could probably appraise those in a way that we do. But it's kind of hard to ever know for sure because you can't read their consciousness.
Right. So to build on your ideas, and your interpretation. So there are some experiments that go over the idea of learned helplessness within rats and dogs. So essentially, the conclusions for this are that these mammals will eventually just give up hope, essentially. And if you subject a dog to shocks for too long and just don't stop, they just will stop caring. And certain rats will commit suicide if they're not domesticated, but you can train these rats so they don't commit suicide if they're swimming in a pool and they get exhausted. They will have the drive to survive. If you train these rats, they will learn to have the hope of the helping hand eventually. So it's just a different scientific perspective on the idea of learned helplessness and more hopelessness in animals rather than strictly hope. So this final section is over music. So how does music affect you, and what do you think is occurring biologically within you, knowing what we just said about neurochemistry?
Yeah, I guess music would be, I mean, you recognize music in the temporal lobe, your ears pick it up and you sort of understand the rhythm. And then in some way that evokes some kind of emotion. So it could be scary or like appealing in more of a love oriented way. And you have those neurochemical reactions, whatever it is, whether it's the amygdala or oxytocin, and that produces an emotion. It's just another stimuli by which emotion can be produced.
Right. So it can be used in humans for like maybe a sexual stimuli or like a religious stimuli to unify people. And then also historically, evolutionarily, music has followed humans throughout generations, and it's continued on to us today. But it was present for early humans too, potentially as an early form of communication, maybe. And in non-human animals, many of them can recognize elements of music like timbre or frequency or rhythm. And some of them have musical rituals for mating and such. So my final question is music actually evolutionary beneficial to humans and non-humans, or is it just a product of that? And it's just something that's followed us, and it's more for enjoyment for the emotional stimuli.
Well, emotions themselves are a product of something that's important, which is recognizing stimuli and responding accordingly. The emotion itself doesn't actually have anything to do with responding accordingly. It's just the way your body handles deciding to do that. And music is sort of just an extension of emotion that way. It's just one way to reproduce it. So music and emotions could be seen as vestigial. You don't necessarily need them, but they are a necessary product of things that you do need. And if one group does have emotions, and that leads to them passing on their genes, and you end up having that.
Right. Awesome. Thank you.